Thanks, Marina, and thank you for inviting me to talk today, and for everyone joining. Yeah, I guess I'll start sharing. You can see that all right? Yeah, like Marina mentioned, I am a graduate from Leiden University, and I'm originally from Vancouver, BC. So the content that I'm going to discuss with you today is from my master's thesis, which I completed in September 2019. I did my degree in heritage management and with a second focus in digital archaeology. So there's an intersection of both of these areas within the research. So I'm going to start off by listing off my research questions and then give you a very brief history of Canada's colonial past. And then going to discuss what repatriation is and the challenges of it before leading into adding digital tools to the repatriation debate and the ethical implications that can arise with this. And then I'll move on to my own practical research into the logistics of digitizing cultural material using photogrammetry and laser scanning in order to compare their cost and time investments. And with that in mind, I conclude by offering some suggestions or recommendations for undertaking such a project in the future with some extra resources that may be of further help. So I chose this topic in order to delve into two main events that occurred just prior to starting my master's. The first one was the 2017 symposium in British Columbia, Canada, about Indigenous perspectives to repatriation, particularly the key findings on how Indigenous communities and museums feel about digitizing repatriated material. And one key finding in particular stated that First Nations welcome digital access to collections, but more work needs to be done to address confusion around digital formats, content management, and repositories. And the second event was the French government announcing their intention to return artifacts of African heritage back to their source communities, and particularly how the report written by Dr. Sarr and Dr. Savoy recommends digitizing this material and what effect this would have on how the museum industry and Indigenous communities will work towards restitution. So with these events in mind, my thesis looked at the state of repatriation within British Columbia and how the Royal BC Museum in particular, located in Victoria, how they manage it, as well as global calls for repatriation. And I also looked at the motivations for digitization from a museum's perspective and from an Indigenous perspective with the help of multiple case studies. And then I looked at some of the legal, ethical, and logistical implications that arise when you digitize cultural material undergoing repatriation. And for the logistical aspect, I aimed at looking at 3D imaging as the digitization method that could be in the future more commonplace within repatriation. And for this part, I had a lot of help from Dr. Genevieve Hill, the collections manager at the Royal BC Museum, and from Lucy Bell, who's the former head of repatriation at the Royal BC Museum. And she's also a current PhD candidate and founding member of the Haida Heritage Society. So they both helped a lot in terms of practical discussions regarding the feasibility of digitizing within BC museums. So I want to start by offering a bit of historical context to this discussion. So the earliest likely archaeological evidence we have so far of human occupation in what is now generally referred to as Canada is 13,000 years old. And Europeans did not begin arriving on the continent until the 15th century. So from 1534 to 1759, the colonial powers of the British and French empires fought for control over this land and eventually resulted in the victory of the United Kingdom. And after a complex expansion and separation between the British colony and the United States of America, the British Parliament passed the British North American Act, which created the Dominion of Canada on July 1st, 1867. So throughout the 19th century and with the passing of the Indian Act in 1876, the government of the newly formed Dominion of Canada made it a high priority to systematically eliminate Indigenous peoples and cultures and ignored their rights through the process of assimilation, which is better termed today as genocide. So children were forced from their homes and their families. They were placed in church-run residential schools, and they were forced to abandon their languages and cultures and customs. And spiritual leaders were persecuted, ceremonial practices were forbidden, and objects of sacred value were confiscated. So in 1885, the government passed the Potlatch Ban, which made illegal all visible aspects of expressive culture, including art and ritual. And for those of you who may not know, the potlatch is a ceremonial event where material property rights and title are transferred and gifted. And the law wasn't fully enforced until 1921, when the RCMP, or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, began arresting participants of a potlatch hosted by the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation. So more than 750 ceremonial items were confiscated, and they formed the basis of the ethnological collections at museums in Ottawa, Toronto, and New York. And in 1979, the National Museum of Man in Ottawa returned this collection, which was then distributed between two communities in Alert Bay and Cape Mudge, British Columbia. So this is just one example of a long history of confiscation and coerced buying of objects that still make up collections around the world. So if we fast forward to 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reported the extent of the atrocities and the effects that they still have on Indigenous peoples today. And the recommendations towards reconciliation have been outlined with 94 calls to action, one of which is dedicated to calling upon the Canadian government to improve practices and policies of Canadian museums and archives. So in 2017, delegates from First Nation communities and museum representatives from across British Columbia attended a repatriation symposium in order to discuss how museums and archives can meet this specific call to action. And as I mentioned, discussions on the digitization aspect of the symposium formed the relevance of this thesis. So we should start out with what repatriation actually is. Simply put, it's the process of returning something to its owner or country of origin. And there have been many instances of cultural repatriation over the years, both internationally and domestically. So some of these examples include this mosaic of St. Mark back to Cyprus from the Netherlands, a marble column back to Greece from the UK, a collection of pottery artifacts to Libya from the United States, and 300 artifacts, including this mask, back to the Nisga'a Nation by the Royal BC Museum and the Canadian Museum of Civilization in Ottawa. So repatriation is a heavily debated issue, and I'm just going to quickly acknowledge both sides of this debate. So those who are for repatriation acknowledge that returning cultural objects is a step towards revitalizing cultures that have been stifled through colonization. And it can provide a renaissance in learning about traditional beliefs and knowledge, both for ancestral communities and also for others to learn about their own country's colonial past. And it can also establish a proof of ability to self-govern and self-represent. And it also acknowledges the religious or ceremonial value of an object that plays a role in current customs and not as material for others to display to the public. And on the other side, apart from the debates concerning who legally owns items, those critical of repatriation reason that it kind of can open up a Pandora's box. So it can set a precedence for returning all objects held in museums, and therefore museums as we know it would cease to exist. There's also the argument that having material collections allows for greater accessibility for global visitors to learn about other cultures. And thirdly, that museums have the facilities to care for and preserve artifacts. So within Europe and North America, there are laws and guidelines constituting if repatriation can legally take place and how it should be handled. Globally, we have UNJIP, which exists for the protection of Indigenous rights. It established a universal framework of minimum standards for rights, including survival, dignity, and the well-being of Indigenous peoples. And Article 12 directly addresses repatriation, stating that Indigenous peoples have the right to use and control their ceremonial objects and the right to repatriate their human remains. And regarding cultural institutions, it also says that states shall seek to enable the access and/or repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains in their possession through fair, transparent, and effective mechanisms developed in conjunction with Indigenous peoples concerned. However, this declaration is not legally binding. It rather represents international legal norms. So you still have some countries that do not abide by this. So for example, in the United Kingdom, they have the British Museum Act of 1963, which originally forbade the repatriation of collections. And this was not until 2010 when the act was amended to allow for the return of human remains. So it's still currently illegal to repatriate objects, but only national government-funded museums in England and Wales are bound by this act. And here in the Netherlands, the National Museum of World Cultures, constituting of the Tropen Museum, the Africa Museum, and the Volkenkunde, they have published their own guidelines on repatriation in the Principles and Processes for Adjusted Claims for the Return of Cultural Objects. So this is kind of a proactive approach that was created with the objective to address the complex histories that have resulted in the collections held in Dutch museums and to outline a way to move towards restitution. In the United States, there is legal legislation on repatriation through NAGPRA, and this provides a process for museums and federal agencies to return certain Native American cultural items and to provide protection for archaeological sites. However, some critiques of NAGPRA are that it can be seen as sort of a blanket guideline, which is inconsiderate to individual Indigenous traditions. And finally, in Canada, there is no federal legislation on repatriation like NAGPRA. However, the BC Treaty Commission process legally binds federal museums to repatriate, enter repatriation agreements with treaty nations. And the Royal BC Museum is one of the only governmentally funded museums in BC, which makes them legally bound to this process. However, they're also willing to repatriate outside of the treaty process. And other museums in BC also repatriate on a voluntary basis. And federal legislation has in fact been suggested through Bill C-391, which is a proposed bill to create a national strategy for repatriation. But this bill, like NAGPRA, has been criticized as too general. There was a lack of consultation with Indigenous communities, and the legislation would only provide funding for museums to repatriate, but not for communities receiving those objects. And I believe this bill is still in the second Senate reading stage as of May 2019. So now that we know some of the political aspects of repatriation, we should look at the logistical implications of it. And if we go back to the main critiques of repatriation, which were setting a precedence for returning everything, providing accessibility to knowledge and cultures, and museums having facilities to preserve artifacts, these fears are generally unfounded. After speaking with the Royal BC Museum, who wrote this guidebook to repatriation, they note that they are always in the process of repatriating material, yet their fear of losing their ability to display collections is just simply not there due to the amount of material in their care. And the view that museums have proper facilities to care for and preserve artifacts is also unfounded and obviously quite insulting. There are currently no set standards for archaeological facilities in British Columbia. So whether these collections are in a federal museum or an Indigenous run institution, there's really no such thing as a proper facility. So it also works under the incorrect assumption that museums and archaeologists alone hold the knowledge for preservation, while the creators or ancestors of that object do not. Again, it also works under the assumption that all of these items are meant to be preserved. And many cultural items have an explicit life cycle that are still recognized. And finally, providing accessible knowledge for the public on different cultures is an important aspect of the role of museums. But it can also be argued that this is favoring one's own cultural enrichment and education, while ignoring the needs of another's who would like to see these cultural items returned in order to provide education on their own history, or to use this cultural material for its original purpose. And the act of repatriation also provides opportunities to educate the public on the continued importance of Indigenous rights, the significance of cultural material and colonial past. So now that we know the benefits outweigh the risks of repatriation, the actual challenges of repatriating is the cost and, less commonly, ownership disagreements. The repatriation is a hugely costly endeavor. In the first phase of carrying out a request, a large amount of research must be conducted into the object's provenance. And this is usually done alongside community consultants, which can be a great effort for communities understaffed in their cultural departments. And there's also the cost of creating a museum, a cultural center, or an archive in which the object can be housed, and staffing it for the long term. There's the cost of traveling to the institution to view the object and meet with museum representatives. And then there's the cost of transporting the object back home. And finally, oftentimes objects are repatriated in order to fulfill their original purpose of being reburied, and if they're ancestral remains and or funerary objects. So in this case, the cost can be comparable to that of a funeral. And another challenge regards overlapping territorial ownership. So during the collecting spree in the 1800s, museums often documented objects by listing the region, but not the specific community or people that the object or ancestral remains originated from. So the Royal BC Museum's handbook on repatriation suggests contacting neighbors to advise them on the plan to repatriate, to see if there is a need for a joint community consultation. And the Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver has similar guidelines, adding that they will defer their decision to repatriate until any conflict between overlapping communities has been resolved. So alternatives to repatriation include share ownership agreements with museums in which the item is stored in museum depots and curatorial decisions are shared, or having Indigenous people working in mainstream museums in order to safeguard the material and indigenize institutions. And another solution is to utilize new technologies in order to carry out digital repatriation. So digital repatriation is defined as the return of cultural heritage to its place of origin in a digital format. And this term is often applied to museum and archive collections and refers to digitizing photographs, documents, films, and audio recordings. But it's also been used to describe creating 3D models of artifacts in order to return the 3D copy while the museum retains the original, or vice versa. However, is this actually considered repatriation, or is it simply an alternative that just falls too short? And this is not a new question, nor one that I conceived of, but it's still, these discussions are still being had. And with the continual increase in interest for digitizing archaeological material, especially ones that we can consider to be at risk in one way or another, we need to continue looking at this concept with a lot of scrutiny. And there are actually very few examples of repatriation in which 3D tools were successfully implemented while the object was returned to its source community. So I'll provide 2 case studies where this did happen, and 2 case studies in which nothing physical was repatriated, but to show the benefit of these tools when there is successful collaboration between cultural institutions and Indigenous communities and individuals. So the first example is a collaborative effort between the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of Natural History and the Tlingit Nation, which shows an example of successful 3D reconstruction in repatriation. After the passage of NAGPRA, Mark Jacobs Jr., a Tlingit clan leader from Sitka, Alaska, who was responsible for the care of his clan's cultural belongings, pursued repatriation of items that had been lost over the century. A killer whale clan crest hat that had been made in 1900 and illegally sold to a Smithsonian ethnologist. In 2005, during the repatriation process, the killer whale hat, during the repatriation of the killer whale hat, Mark Jacobs Jr. unfortunately fell ill and was hospitalized, inciting the Smithsonian to expedite the return. So Jacobs passed away a few days later with the hat by his side, and a memorial service was held during which the killer whale hat was danced and transferred to the new clan caretaker. And the ceremonial object was once again able to serve its intended purpose. So during the request to have the killer whale clan crest returned to the Tlingit community, staff at the Smithsonian Institute recognized the opportunity for using digital technology as an aid for cultural preservation and education. So the repatriation of the hat demonstrated the importance of clan crest objects to the Tlingit as a way to strengthen their heritage. And the Institute was looking for ways to educate visitors about the importance of this repatriation. However, they recognized that exhibits on repatriation are difficult without the aid of the object itself. So through consultation with clan leaders, the museum were authorized to laser scan the original object and create a replica to use for the exhibit in order to educate the public on the Tlingit crest object and the story of its repatriation. And another project undertaken by the Smithsonian Institute was the Delaware Replication pilot, in which, similarly to the previous example, they had created a replica of a repatriated object. In 2007, the Stockbridge Munsee tribe of Wisconsin, the Delaware Nation, and the Delaware tribe of Oklahoma requested the repatriation of culturally affiliated human remains and associated funeral objects from the Mininsink site. During the request process, a repatriation representative for the Stockbridge Munsee tribe proposed a 3D replication project where the museum would laser scan and 3D print a replica of a 17th century pewter pipe that had been found with a burial. So the original pipe was unique to Munsee material culture and illustrated the wealth and trade relations of the people at the time. And replicating the pipe allowed her to teach about the historic Munsee culture and the importance of repatriation. And meanwhile, the original pipe was reburied, addressing the spiritual concerns of the three tribes. And multiple replicas were created so that each tribe could have a copy to display in their communities in order to educate tribal members about their material culture. So moving on to a case that did not have an original object repatriated. In 2015, Tanya Larson, a student with Gwich'in ancestry, studying at the Institute of American Indian Arts at Santa Fe, she used 3D modeling to recreate a collection of tools previously made by her ancestors in the Northwest Territories. She used laser scanning and photogrammetry to create models of tanning tools and fishing spears, and then 3D printed them out of sandstone to use as reference models so she could build identical tools using traditional methods such as bone and antler. And the artist conducted this study in order to reconnect with her heritage and to use new technologies as a way to recreate and continue her cultural traditions. The tools recreated by Larson have also been made into child-friendly 3D printed models so that museum visitors can handle them. And the final case study we have is the Thule Whalebone House. Inuit elders from the Kivalliq district and Baffin region of Nunavut share the concern that knowledge of their traditional lifestyle is being lost, and they're seeking out ways to excite interest in traditional knowledge among Inuit youth. So in 2011, researchers at the University of Calgary published about a virtual world they created, which simulates the experience of living in a dual culture whalebone house in the Canadian Arctic. During the 13th century, Thule people constructed semi-subterranean houses for the winter seasons out of large whale bones as the primary framing material. And a 3D model of the whalebone house was constructed using archaeological data and a series of objects selected from the Glenbow Museum collection. They were laser scanned and digitally placed inside of the house. And using a VR headset, users could explore the house and interact with the objects. Elders who viewed the VR noted that they were moved by the experience and they were reminded of stories that they would hear about their ancestors. So this project demonstrated that the 3D immersion generated a high level of connectedness, and that 3D applications were powerful tools in repatriation. However, this was more of a repatriation of traditional knowledge and not of anything physical. So from these case studies, we can see that there are a number of benefits. But I would now like to touch on the ethical and legal implications of digitizing cultural material. As repatriation is often contentious due to multiple parties claiming legal ownership over an item, questions about ownership of digital copies can become even more nuanced. So who owns the data and who owns the physical copy? So I'll discuss the difficulties of open access through the example of the Sarn-Savoy report written for the French government's call to restitution. And open access and copyright is a very specific field. And I think a lot of you, especially in the digital archaeology group, are more trained in this area. So if you have anything to add afterwards in the discussion, please feel free. So as we know, open access means anyone can freely access, use, modify, and share for any purpose. And one of the key principles of Open GLAM, which stands for open access to galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, is that reproductions of public domain work should remain in the public domain when it is digitized. So while cultural heritage is under public domain, digital surrogates are not automatically. They belong to, if they are under an open access license, they could be in the public domain, meaning they belong to no one and everyone. But there's the other possibility that users of the model have to attribute the creator of the model under the Creative Commons license. And as I'll explain, this usually means that the digital copy is attributed to the museum where the online catalog is held, and not to the ancestral community to whom the original object belongs and is being repatriated to. So named after his authors, the Sarn-Savoy report was commissioned by the French government to look into developing a restitution strategy in order to return African cultural heritage to their community of origin. The report caused a lot of governments outside of France to also reevaluate their restitution and repatriation policies. And one of its recommendations was about digitizing cultural heritage and sharing of digital content. So I'll share these recommendations followed by critiques outlined by Dr. Pavis and Dr. Wallace, professors of law at the University of Exeter. So the first recommendation was that digitized objects must be made part of a radical practice of sharing. And the second one was that there should be a creation of a single portal providing access to this precious documentation in the form of a platform that would then be open access. And the third recommendation was that a systematic digitization of documents that have yet to be digitized concerning Africa should be established. So the problem with these, applying an open access policy onto African heritage actually creates a double standard if it's not also being applied to all French and international and digital heritage. And according to a 2018 survey, only 15 French institutions are actually engaging in open GLAM for their collections. Furthermore, when digital images are online, they need to be attributed to the community of origin in their copyright license, and not only to the museum or its creators, because then they solely own that copy and the origin community have no legal right to it. The systematic digitization is problematic because, again, the copyright will end up going to the French institutions, and it's taking away the decision-making from the community of origin that a restitution program had intended to give. And this suggestion of creating a single online portal was also a topic at the 2017 Symposium on Repatriation in British Columbia. One key finding from this meeting was that communities would like to develop their own database, and very few supported a consolidated inventory housed within a single institution, because it simply just gives too much power to that institution. So just to show you an example of a digital surrogates open access policy, the Tlingit killer whale hat scanned by the Smithsonian suggests that users attribute the Smithsonian since they are the creators of the 3D model. Since this was a highly collaborative project, it could very well be that the community was consulted about this copyright licensing, but it's just good to be thinking about how digital surrogates of culturally sensitive artifacts are shared, used, and owned. So digitization is not a neutral process. It may seem natural and beneficial to digitize, but when we need to become fully aware of the problems associated with it. And there are more problems than I have time to discuss here, such as internet access and the digital divide. Furthermore, if digitizing is done without the consent of the community who is having their object repatriated, and the digital copy is retained by the museum, that can be seen as a form of digital colonialism. So digital repatriation is a term usually thrown around as a way to retain scientific and archaeological value of an object that is being repatriated. If the digital format and not the original object is being returned, that is not repatriation. It's just a return of information. So instead, I suggest that we should be striving more for a digital reciprocity in which collaborative research brings about the repatriation of an artifact while using digital tools to produce a reciprocal exchange of information for continued cultural research. So there should be a return of the original object. And if digital tools are used, the data can be reciprocally shared between the source community and the museum. So to switch gears slightly, part of the aim of this thesis was to contribute to the discussion on how and if digitization can be effectively carried out within the repatriation process. And for this, I created a workflow for documenting objects in order to determine the cost and time investment that would then be added onto the logistical procedures of repatriation. So this information was then shared with the Royal BC Museum in order to discuss the feasibility of carrying out such a project in their repatriation department. And I chose material that was available at the Faculty of Archaeology here in Leiden. They are replica basketry created by former students studying experimental archaeology. And since basketry is a common artifact found on the Northwest Coast, they served as the basis for comparing digitization methods of photogrammetry and 3D laser scanning. And unfortunately, I'm not going to go into the details of how these methods work due to time, but if you're interested, I can also link another presentation I did recently about this and a tutorial for photogrammetry. And I also want to be honest here, these models are among the first that I ever created while learning photogrammetry and laser scanning. So after 2 years of 3D imaging since this, they probably look a bit less problematic. But I think it helps show the learning curve that goes into these methods. So it's an important consideration if undertaking such a project. Who's going to be doing the documentation? How long do you expect the process to take? And what quality do you want the product to be? So these models were created from a replica woven child shoe. The applications I used for this were Agisoft Metashape for photogrammetry and the Next Engine laser scanner. I used a turntable for photogrammetry and laser scanning and elevated the shoe vertically to capture all sides of the object. However, this object posed a challenge to record because of the ankle tie, which moved around a lot and created multiple meshes. The laser scan version did capture more surface area of the object, while the photogrammetry version had more holes in the mesh. But this was most likely due to error during the image capturing stage. So overall, the laser scan version created a more accurate depiction of the object. However, the textured surface is more realistic on the photogrammetry version. And with these results in mind, I compared the tools required, the cost, and the time and data size produced. So for photogrammetry, a camera, computer, and the Agisoft Metashape license was required. And for laser scanning, on the other hand, it was just the scanner and computer. The cost can be quite variable, with the Next Engine costing about $3,000 US, and while Agisoft software can be between $5,900 and $3,500, depending on the license used. And of course, Agisoft is not the only software for photogrammetry, and there are some pretty good free and open access versions. So the time to record and render these models were not too different, taking between 3 and 4 hours for photogrammetry and 5 and 6 hours for laser scanning. But this can fluctuate depending on the quality settings you use in each program and how much post-processing needs to be done. The data size did differ greatly, with photogrammetry having a much smaller data set. And this is an important consideration when determining who and where is archiving this data. So the laser scanned version was of higher quality, but the photogrammetry method is the most cost, time, and size efficient when I was using the educational license. Work that I've completed since this project, however, has changed my mind somewhat. I still believe that photogrammetry is an effective and portable tool for this purpose, but I'm now aware of much better scanners than the Next Engine that offer higher quality, quicker rendering, higher resolution texture, and a smaller data set. However, they usually come at a higher price point. So as I mentioned, this practical component was included in order to discuss with the Royal BC Museum the feasibility of including digital applications in their repatriation program. And after having this discussion with the former head of repatriation, Lucy Bell, we agreed that this addition could be beneficial, especially after seeing the case studies through the Smithsonian. However, the added time and cost investments did not make it a desirable addition for the time being. It would have to be determined who would fund the digitization component, and discussions should be held on a case-by-case basis, with each individual ancestral community having their material repatriated in order to determine what the benefit would be for them. So with this future possibility in mind, I've created a list of recommendations for 3D imaging of repatriated material should communities and museums be interested. Firstly, there should be repatriation without restriction, meaning that if the community does not want to digitize these objects, there should be no digitization. The second point is not so much about digital heritage itself, but within the museum sector, of course, we should be striving for greater inclusion of descending communities into these spaces. But when there's also digitization, it should absolutely be done in collaboration with those receiving the repatriated material. And it can also provide opportunities for training sessions in 3D methods. The fourth point comes from an article by Lorna Hughes and Andrew Prescott on slow digitization, meaning you should really be thinking about why you're wanting to digitize this material and take into consideration what the benefits are on a case-by-case basis and what the plan is regarding budget, storage, and open access. And this leads to the final recommendation. There should be access to the 3D data for the source community, as well as mutual decisions on copyright licenses and how the 3D copy is going to be used. So to conclude, there are many benefits for repatriation, both in terms of assisting in revitalization of cultures and establishing proof to self-represent, but also providing education on colonial past and its current effects. There are different legislations concerning repatriation worldwide, and although Canada does not have federal legislation, there is still successful repatriation going on. There's still some logistical issues with repatriation that can take a lot of collaboration in order to overcome. And with the insertion of digital applications, those logistics can become even more nuanced. So there have been examples of successful repatriation which implemented 3D imaging. And seen from the case studies, there are often joint motivations from source communities and museums. But the important distinction is that the physical original object is repatriated to the source community, while the 3D copy is created for the benefit of both the museum and the community. There are also many other benefits to using 3D tools in collaboration with Indigenous communities, and sometimes that results in a revitalization and sharing of traditional knowledge. However, when digitizing material undergoing repatriation, whether it's in 3D or 2D, it is imperative to consider the intellectual property and open access. If digital cultural heritage is a part of repatriated cultural material, there needs to be consideration to ownership and access in the digital form. The digital copy is, of course, not a substitute for the original. And this is why I don't really like the term digital repatriation. But if there is a digital copy, we should still treat it with just as much consideration as the original. So finally, I've provided some resources for anyone interested in this topic. Digitization is a collaborative initiative between BC Aboriginal groups and academic partners that facilitate capacity building in Indigenous information management. The Reciprocal Research Network is an online tool to facilitate reciprocal and collaborative research about cultural heritage from the Northwest Coast of British Columbia. The RBCM handbook, like I mentioned, provides a guide for Indigenous communities aiming to repatriate their objects. iPinch is an international collaborative research project that works to explore and facilitate fair and equitable exchanges of knowledge relating to heritage. And finally, my own website, which provides tutorials in 3D imaging cultural material. And yeah, I just want to give a big thank you to my thesis supervisor, Dr. Henner Lanes-Ortez, and to Dr. Genevieve Hill and Lucy Bell for all their help in this topic. So thank you.